Britain is in crisis, but it's a crisis you haven't heard very much about. Productivity, meaning how much output workers are able to make, has not been growing since the financial crisis. This has major implications for living standards as well as for the public finances. Discussing this with me today is Sarah O'Connor, our employment correspondent. So Sarah, let's have a look at what's happening to productivity in the UK over the last few years. And as we see, Britain is the red line. The red line at the bottom is the productivity performance, and the red dotted line is the productivity performance had Britain continued on the pre-crisis trend. And we see a very large gap.
Yeah, I mean, that line that you can see extending from 1997 up until the crisis, that almost seemed as if it was some kind of economic rule of law that every year productivity would grow by about 1.75%. It always had, and we kind of thought that it always would. What happened after the crisis was a big shock because, as you can see, it basically flatlined. There's been a problem in other countries as well. You can see that blue line, which is the other kind of rich economies, they've also seen productivity slow, but very much the UK is at the centre of this big productivity puzzle. And so when you hear about the jobs miracle in the UK, when you hear about the cost of living crisis in the UK, at the heart of both of those phenomenons is the fact that productivity is just not growing.
Now, the FT has done some unpacking. We've crunched the numbers, and we can look at the second chart, which is trying to understand in which sectors have been driving this puzzle. And our answer is that there are 4 sectors which is worth looking at. So manufacturing, telecommunications, banking, and professional services. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on here?
Yeah, so we've tried to sort of disaggregate, okay, so we know that output per hour has stagnated, but which sectors are really driving that? And we think that these 4 account for about 75% of the so-called productivity puzzle, of the shortfall.
Despite being just a small proportion of the UK economy, they explain 3/4.
Yeah, they're nothing like 75% of the economy as a whole, but they're kind of packing a bigger punch when it comes to explaining this productivity shortfall. So some of these are quite easy to explain. Banking, for example. Banking productivity was growing very quickly in the boom years. The banks across the river there were doing lots and lots of business. Since then, their output has actually been falling, and they haven't cut headcount by anywhere near as much. So that's why productivity there has started to come off. With some of the others, it's a slightly more subtle story. For manufacturing, for example, it used to be that it really punched above its weight in terms of productivity growth. Productivity is still rising in manufacturing, but just not as quickly as before. So that helps to explain a bit of the shortfall. And similarly, for professional services, these are accountants, lawyers, people like that. They too have seen a very sharp slowdown in their productivity growth.
Right, and what has the government tried to do about it? I mean, what's your assessment of the coalition record on productivity and boosting productivity?
Well, I mean, the record, if you look at the numbers, is obviously pretty dire, but it has to be said that it's very hard for governments to do anything very quickly to change productivity. When you try and do things to change the sort of supply capacity of the economy, it can take quite a long time. The sorts of things that you want to do are find ways to boost research and development, because that creates new inventions that can make us all more productive in our work. Things like that, or improve the housing market so that people can move around more easily to the places where they can be most productive. I think the coalition has a sort of mixed record. It's done some things well. It's kind of carried on some good work that the previous government were doing in terms of kind of keeping regulation quite low, promoting competition in various sectors. But equally, they haven't done an awful lot to improve things like the UK's woeful underinvestment in infrastructure, nor have they really done anything to fix the kind of sclerotic housing market in the UK.
And unfortunately, it's something which is not exciting the political parties at the moment. We're just a few weeks ahead of the election. They seem to be talking about a lot of things, but productivity is really not up there.
No, I don't think productivity was mentioned at all in George Osborne, who we see there, his final budget of this Parliament, even though it's really critical not only for our living standards, as we've discussed, but also for the public finances. If productivity continues to disappoint, then that hole in the public finances will only be bigger. Equally, if it improves, then we'll have much less austerity than we think.
But Sarah O'Connor, thank you very much for being with us today. So productivity is really the most important and least discussed question in British politics. Whether the new government will do anything about it, well, that remains to be seen.